It's that idea of being inside that viva and you're going, everything's going confidently and well. And then that question comes from the external or the internal, being fair, which catches you, it's a trajectory or a tangent I haven't considered, nor has been picked up in my research, nor maybe my supervisor hasn't thought of, but it's completely relevant. And at that moment, blankness, or you just find yourself in that space of how do I respond, what do I do? Because the implicit fear, of course, is not to fail this viva. I've worked for 3.5, 4 years to get here, and I don't want 30 seconds to take away all of that.
I think it's natural that most students will be nervous about the viva. I think there's several reasons for that. First of all, in most of their experience, a viva will be an alien form of assessment, something they've never come across before. Secondly, the student may not be aware of the kind of support and advice that's available within the university. And thirdly, they may well have heard of stories and rumours about past vivas and the problems associated with them, which in my experience are largely unfounded.
I think there's a potentially a lack of confidence, that they feel they're going to be tripped up, and they think that perhaps that the examiners are setting out to trip them up. The examiners have come determined to find that hole in the thesis and really pick at it and have a go at it for you. That's not the way in which their role is defined and how they will see their role. Their role is to really understand your research, to understand what you've done, to question you on areas where they're not clear or where they think it needs further clarification, but they're really there to give you an opportunity to tell them about your research, to tell them what you've done, to explain the significance of it, to elaborate on any issues that you feel are particularly important and so on. So don't feel that the examiners are there to make it difficult for you. You may feel that at the time, but they are there to help you through the process.
So the assessment of the research degree is not based solely on the viva, but also on the thesis itself. And the viva is important, but just a small part of the overall assessment process. It's important to remember that in the very rare cases where a research degree might be failed, it's most unlikely to be on the basis of the viva. The university itself is committed to fair and consistent assessment processes, so they have documentation to describe the nature and purpose of the viva and the role of the external and internal examiners. So you should really make sure that you read that. For example, in the University of Bristol, the code of practice that we provide. If there are any extenuating circumstances, for example a long-term medical problem, then do let the relevant people know so that advice can be given and allowance made. So I think if you take all those points into consideration, then there really is no need to be worried about the viva, and certainly no need to panic. As you walk into the viva room, you're undoubtedly going to be a little bit nervous, but a small amount of adrenaline is no bad thing.
They're looking for is to make sure you wrote it. You did the work. You were the researcher that carried out this research, and you wrote the thesis. So that's the first part of it, an authentication, if you like, that you were the person that did this work.
Clarification. You can discuss in the viva, discuss any points that are really not clear from the thesis. The student that has a real opportunity in the viva to explain to the examiners exactly what he or she means by a particular point. In this context, theses are often strong on data. They've got the student will have generated in 3 or 4 years, however long they've been researching, lots and lots and lots of data, but quite often in my experience they're a bit light on real discussion of the data, and the examiners will want to ensure that the student understands the difference between data and discussion and conclusions.
Context. This is an important aspect that the examiner needs to find out about. In other words, do you as the candidate understand where your work fits into everything else? Are you aware of the wider context of your work? Do you understand how your work fits in, let's say, with social trends, or perhaps there's a link with industrial practice or professional issues? In other words, I need to know that you understand the context of your work. In other words, you haven't done this work in a bubble, but you're fully aware of how it fits in. justification. Now, what do I mean by justification? Well, what I'm talking about here is I need you as the candidate, the person writing the thesis, to be able to justify your work to me. I need you to be able to explain why you've done this work, why is it important, why have you spent 3 years of your life sweating over this particular project. So you do need to be able to justify the work that you've done and the importance of the work that you've done.
Click on the coloured buttons for advice on how you should prepare for your viva.
First thing I would say is be prepared. This is a major interview in your early career as a scholar and academic, and it needs to be taken with the utmost seriousness.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you will prepare for your viva.
Well, before the viva, I want to make absolutely sure I know my thesis inside and out. I want to put little tags in at different points in the thesis, post-it notes and bookmarks, so that I can refer to particular parts without having to flip through and find something important. Another thing that I'm going to do is make a little section of notes at the back, areas that I might not feel particularly confident working on from scratch, so that I can refer to them later on during the viva. And in this way I feel like I'll be pretty prepared for any unknown circumstances. Well, in advance of the viva itself, I want to make sure that I'm perfectly comfortable with the surroundings that I'm going to be in. So I'll find out which room that the viva will be held in, and I'll also find out which chair I'm going to be sat in, because I'll be there for a few hours. So if the chair's not comfortable, I want to have the opportunity to swap it or bring a cushion in. I want to find out where the loos are and where the water fountain is, and so that's one less thing to worry about.
So as to the question of how long does a viva last, again, I think that depends from person to person. For me, it's usually, say, 2 or 3 hours. I wouldn't read much into how long the viva lasts. As to the outcome, whether it's short or whether it's long, I don't think is very well correlated with the outcome of the viva. So it will last as long as it needs to last.
At the beginning of the examination, I'll normally take the lead, whether I'm the internal examiner or the external examiner, in introducing the examination. The internal examiner, the external examiner, the student.
Now, it's normal for the external examiner to take the lead in a viva, so that's what you would expect. The external examiner will ask most of the questions. The internal examiner typically will chip in. Remember, the external examiner is expert in your field. The internal examiner is probably not an expert in your field, but will have read your thesis, and therefore your thesis should be intelligible to that person, and they will ask probably a slightly different style of question. Now, when I ask a question, I think it's very important that you, as the person that's written the thesis, listen very carefully, that you answer the question that's given to you. In other words, don't answer a question that you would like to answer unless it's the one that's actually been asked. And if you don't answer the question, then frankly the examiner will just ask it again. So listen carefully, try and understand the question and reply. Now if you don't understand it, I think it's perfectly acceptable to ask the examiner to ask again or rephrase or something like that. If you still don't know the answer to that question, I think it's okay to say I don't know. I think it's far better to say I don't know than to bluff, because it's very obvious if a candidate tries to bluff, and that would be a mistake.
Just concluding, you will probably have had a couple of hours conversations, and you may well have had a 10-minute break in the middle. You will have invited the student to add any points that they wish to help your analysis and elaboration. And then the time comes for the examiner and the internal examiner to come to a view on what decision is made.
At that point, we'll stop the viva and ask the student to withdraw. Having explained the purpose of asking the student to withdraw is so that we, the two examiners, can review the answers to the questions, review the student's performance in the viva, and come to a decision about the outcome. The student leaves the room. This could be for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And the students shouldn't read into the length of time how well or badly the discussions are going about the outcome. It just depends on how waffly the examiners are with each other. The internal examiner will normally give the decision to the student. The outcome at the end of the viva can be, well, certainly at Bath we've got about 7 or 8 different possible outcomes. But in most cases it will be pass with minor corrections to be made to the thesis. The internal examiner will explain the process from there on. There'll be a lot of handshaking and smiling, and that's it. Student leaves happy.
This module is now complete. Here are some key points to reflect on. The viva is not something to be feared, but it is certainly something to take seriously. Whilst you are being examined principally on the standard of your thesis, you are also being examined on your ability to present and defend arguments relevant to your work, as well as your understanding of the context of your research. Each university has its own definitive administrative rules and procedures. Make it your business to know what these are. Be prepared. Anticipate the questions you'll be asked and prepare responses for them. And finally, relax. Once you've completed your thesis, most of the hard work is done.